Welcome back, everyone. I think that we can start the second part of our paper presentation session. Now we have other two very interesting papers. The first one, paper and presentation is by Maria Gutierrez Urtiaga, University Carlos III de Madrid. I think that this paper looks at a crucial question, basically at how political and institutional dynamics can favor or maybe hinder the adoption of the 28 regime and the acceptance through the member states. So I think that this is a very important question, and we look forward to the presentation, and the floor is yours, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for inviting us to this critical and so interesting debate. So the paper, well, I will say proto paper that I'm going to present today, ongoing work with Maribel Sáez from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid and European Corporate Governance Institute. And what is the main idea of what we are trying to do? So we are all wondering whether the 28th regime will solve the current problems of fragmentation within legal fragmentation within the European Union. And from the previous discussions and from all the papers that people are writing, interesting papers on this, we see that there is a lot of interest on which should be the optimal design of this regime and which should be the focus and how to contribute to growth of the European economy and to contribute to firms' development. However, we have to be aware that previous attempts in this direction have either failed or been diluted. Yes. So taking this into account, what we ask in this paper is which features of the regime are most likely to ensure its adoption in a model of political economy. So we are considering political feasibility alongside efficiency, and this is where we come in. Now, to do this, we develop a very simple lobbying game where we have policymakers that are going to choose the policy that will be implemented, and when they do this, they internalize the preferences of several parties. In particular, we consider voters, established firms, startups, and other economic actors that may benefit from the status quo. So now, the way we understand the institutional setting is that the 28th regime has focused on business law because this is a tractable starting point, so maybe the harmonization should be wider, and touch upon labor laws or bankruptcy or whatever, but this is what we have. Now, what we see is that there are many different ways in which the 28th regime could go. Should it facilitate innovation? Should promote cheaper incorporation? Should help established firms scale? Or there are many options. But as I said before, we know that previous attempts have failed to harmonize business law, to induce competition among member states, and even mutual recognition is difficult in the European Union. So we think this is a clear case of legal path dependence, meaning that we know that the current rules are inefficient. However, they are maintained because of rent-seeking incentives. Okay, so we try to put the different interest groups into a model where the politicians have to choose rules to see which are the forces that have hindered the adoption of past regulations, and that could make it difficult for the 28th regime to be really implemented and have an impact. So just let me start explaining the very simple lobbying model that we have in mind, because the assumptions are the critical part here. So we think about an economy with two periods, and we think about a public official. This public official is the one that is going to choose between two alternative policies. One is the status quo, X0, and an alternative policy, the 20th regime, X prime. And the incentives of the public official is that he has to run for re-election at time t equal 2 at the end of the game. And then the public official is going to interact with economic agents. Now, we have many economic agents, but they organize, we think of them as organized into types. So there is a number of agents of each type. For example, we think about established firms being one type. We think about startups being another type, etc. And now, each of these economic agents generates some value. Yes, and this value depends on the policy in place. So here, in this value function, what we are trying to capture is the fact that if the policy in place is very different from the best policy for this particular actor, this decreases the total value that this company generates, which will be important for reasons. So this is how the policy, how we capture the idea that the policy affects the productivity and the value of firms within the economy and any other actor. So now, because this is a lobbying model, we assume that these types can organize into lobby groups. And here we have lobby groups that may be for change to the new policy or against change to the new policy. So because our value function is so simple, basically they will be for if the distance between the preferred policy and the proposal is lower than the distance from their preferred policy and the status quo policy. And then, considering the preferred policy, each agent can contribute to lobby. So they can make a contribution to lobby politicians. Now, we have different agents, so there are different lobbies depending on the types of these agents. So we can have the lobby of established firms, the lobby of startups, the lobby of corporate lawyers, etc. And these lobbies aggregate all the contributions from the agents of these particular types. Now, how do we think about these lobbying efforts? Many lobbying models are drawn by American scholars, and they usually focus on campaign contributions. Now, in the European setting, this may not be so appropriate, but lobbying can take many forms. So, for example, you can think about spending these funds in promotion of public opinion campaigns to shift voters' preferences, or preparation or participation in regulatory hearings. You can even think about academics getting together, gathering at a workshop, no, as a kind of lobbying. So then, what is the politician going to do? Well, basically, remember, we assume the public official wants to be re-elected by the voters, and we assume that the probability of re-election depends on taxable income, meaning the amount that is produced by economic agents that benefits the voters, and by lobbying contributions. So then, this looks like a strange animal here, but what this equation is saying is that the alternative policy will be approved the more it contributes to the more the change contributes to the taxable value of the economic agents. So tau J is the tax rate that can be applied to agents of type J. And the higher the contribution from the lobbies that support that policy. Now, so we have three very important variables here. The first is the tax rate, and we assume the tax rate can be different for different economic agents. So why do we make this assumption? Now, if you think about established firms and startups, it's clear that established firms may be easier to tax than startups, particularly firms, because startups are more mobile. So any economic agent that uses more mobile factors of production is going to be more difficult to tax. Yes, and this is key. Also, if we have a policy that allows firms in one particular jurisdiction to move to other jurisdiction, this basically makes the local politicians unable to tax this group. So this is an important force. This can be an important force operating in the politician preferences. Then we also have a discount rate because we are considering different two periods. And another crucial parameter here is tau, is lambda. So, gamma. So tau is the tax rate and gamma is the influence of the different lobby groups. So some lobby groups can be closer to the politicians than other groups, or for example, they may be closer to local politicians than to European Union politicians. So this is something that we should take into account. Now, well, the game is very simple. The policy is chosen at the beginning, and then it's in place for 2 periods. But each economic agent decides how much to contribute to the lobby groups. All the lobby groups make contributions simultaneously. The public official chooses whether to maintain the status quo or deviate to the new proposed policy. And at the end of the 2 periods, the economic agents obtain their revenues and are taxed, and the public official can be re-elected. Now, how do we solve this game? Well, first of all, we have to think about the contribution that each agent wants to make to the lobby. And here, the important thing is to notice that when we shift from one rule to another, this increases the gains of this economic agent. Yes. So the maximum contribution that this economic agent can make to lobbying is the total amount of gains that the agent gets from the change in policy. How much is he going to contribute depends on many things, but for simplicity, we assume that the agents contribute the full amount of their gains. This means that in the bargaining power, the politicians have all the power. We could make alternative assumptions, but this is just made for simplicity. So all the gains that can be achieved from this change in policy will end up going to the politicians, either through taxation or through lobbying. And there is a crucial thing here, which is this is true for all agents that think they can contribute to the political game. But many economic agents don't think they can contribute meaningfully to the political game. The same with voters. This is typical in voting models. So your contribution will depend on whether you think you are a pivotal agent or not. So if we think about firms are going to be the main actors affected by this change, but many small firms, medium-sized firms, will think they cannot really influence the outcome. And given that assumption, so if they think they are not pivotal, they will not contribute. So this is a game for mainly large actors. Yes. So then we capture this through a parameter PJ, which is the percentage of pivotal agents in lobbying group J. Then we can see how the preferences of each group will affect the politician. So, and here we already have some interesting result. The politician will be more likely to change to the preferred policy of a given group, J. The greater is the difference between these two policies. This is a little bit counterintuitive because we think, well, if we don't want to change things too much, maybe this is easier to pass. But this is not the case in this game, because notice that the politicians benefit from big changes to value of the economic agents because they can tax these agents. Then, of course, whether the group is more or less important also depends on the number of economic agents in this group and whether they think they are pivotal or not, and how close the group is to the politician, the lobbying capacity of the group. So the first result that we have is that the politician is very likely to do well. The politician will actually choose the optimal policy conditional on all agents believing they are pivotal and all lobbying groups being equally close to the policymaker. So these are the two conditions that we need to ensure that the optimal policy will be chosen. This is the same as saying that when these two conditions are not met, the politician is unlikely to choose the optimal policy. So now what we do with this game is we try to adapt it to the 28th regime, okay? How do we think about adapting this model to the 28th regime? We think about 3 potential policies, only 3. One of them is preferred by the group of bureaucrats, yes, and this is the current policy. And then we have 2 other groups, only 2. One is the established firms and the other one is startups, yes? So these firms do not, neither established firms nor startups like the status quo, but they may prefer alternative regimes. So we think about 3 potential cases. A case where the proposal is equally good, is different from the status quo and equally good for established firms and for startups. Another regime where the proposal is well suited to startups, but is not ambitious enough for established firms. And one case where the proposal is well suited to startups, but leaves established firms indifferent. Yes, we analyze this game, and what we find is that in this game, path dependence is going to arise more likely when the regime that is being proposed is only relevant to startups. And when this happens, what we find is that this is going to be a very different case for approval. Okay, what are the reasons for this? First of all, if we design a regime that is only for startups, established firms are absent from the process. They don't change their taxable income and they don't lobby. And notice that established firms are the ones that have larger numbers, higher tax rate, and large firms will have closeness to the politicians. If we think about startups, the problem with startups is that their number is small, especially compared to bureaucrats. In the category of bureaucrats, we think about legal firms, notaries, trade unions, registrars, etc. And the startups may not even be present at the table. So then who is to fill the gap in lobbying for this regime? Large investors? Yes, they are the ones that can lobby. Then also, when we think about taxation, we have to understand that taxation may be difficult. It may be difficult to tax the startup in the first period because they are startups, so they are expected to have low taxable income. And then in the second period, startups should become established firms. So there is not a lot of taxable benefits from a model that benefits startups, then pivotality is going to be an issue because, most startups are not think they are pivotal. So this will depend on large investors covering the gap again. And if we think about closeness to politicians, it can be expected that startups are not going to be very close to politicians. So we think the case for approval of the 28th regime design for startups is quite difficult. And well, I'm sorry to end up on this gloomy thought, and that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your presentation. I think that this paper is very important in shedding new light in the process, and maybe also your not very optimistic conclusion is maybe shared also from someone else in this webinar, I think. But now I will leave the floor to the discussant, Cornelia Woll, Hertie School of Berlin. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, and hello from Berlin. And can you hear me? Because it says something.
Yes, it's very well.
And I'm very happy to be the discussant. Thank you, Maria and Maribel, for submitting me your paper. You wrote me, this is a very early stage. All comments welcome, which I always also understand as forgive us for the things that need polishing. So let me first say that I really appreciate the attempt you made at gauging the political feasibility in the 28th regime discussion and the desire to provide a political economy analysis that can guide design choices also with respect to whether things will fail in the political process. I think that's absolutely central and important because all implementation scholars will tell you that most of the great, there's the title of the book, How All Great Ideas in Washington Die in Oakland, California, and in Europe. It would be the same thing if you don't think about the political feasibility. So I'm very much in favor of doing this analysis. And since you've given me the chance to read a very early draft, let me tell you all the areas where I think you can put in some more work to build your case and make it into a convincing argument. And the first point I'd like to make is even just on setting the scene. We're now in a workshop of people who are all interested in similar questions and already starting possibly with some setting. But I think you need to address more explicitly the question, where does opposition to the 28th regime come from? Because in part of your discussion, there is this abstract notion that there are public welfare arguments, efficiency, for example, optimal design, and then there's rent seeking. And I felt that wasn't enough. I think you need a crisper picture of what actually happens when you have regulatory competition. If you have an alternative, who is suffering from the pressure? What's the possibility of a race to the bottom, a Delaware effect? The impact on incumbents and national regulators. And I think if you get a little bit into this, you would move away from just the rent seeking that's relatively present in the argument. So I think that would be helpful because you say, for example, on page 4, as long as those who can block structural transformation do not bear the full costs of persistence, so the inefficiency, inefficient procedures that are already in place might persist. I'd like to challenge you and say that the incumbents who block never bear the full costs of the inefficiency ever. So they're just incumbents. They have invested, they have sunk costs. They want to keep in place what they're used to. But the individual level of cost benefit, I think, doesn't work here. There are other forces at work that you could get out if you did a little bit of the setting the scene part with the literature. And also on the literature, you are very much, but implicitly in economic theory of regulation universe, so Stiegler and others. And I think that's fine, but I think it would still be good to say how you build assumptions about the cost-benefit calculations of the incumbents and of the regulators, or the bureaucrats, as you call them. There are certain things that I think are very much already understood, and it would be helpful if you don't need to prove that again or just say it's an assumption. So in classic interest group theory, we know path dependent, the 28th regime is not a special class of path dependence. We have path dependence in absolutely everything. There is not a single policy that doesn't get stuck at some point for reasons that I think we all know. And what's most important to me is here in your case, you will also have the very concentrated, strong interests of the incumbents and the very spread public interests or interests of newcomers who are not in the market yet. And it would be good if you could reference that. Another point about the assumptions that I had is you say quite explicitly you're only dealing with newcomers who are startups. And I don't think that's helpful. I mean, I think that it's quite clear here also from our discussion in the workshop that there's an interesting part about innovation and startups. But if you really want to talk about political economy, you have to address that some of the newcomers may just be very large firms that have an interest and having, I don't know, the French model become the new model and will lobby for it, but with lobbying power of an incumbent firm from one of the countries. And I think if it would be more appealing to me if I could imagine that that also happens. So you have newcomers with foreign firms, US firms, established firms elsewhere, or the typical startups, and they have interests that they will defend. But if you do that, then you will hit something that I think is the main issue I'm struggling with, and that is what political scene are you actually talking about? Are you talking about EU level lobbying? Are we talking about European Commission bureaucrats or members of parliament? If it's the bureaucrats in the European Commission, they don't react to election like in the economic theory of regulation. So EU lobbying would be something very different to model than if you talk about the elected official. So since you're making a very simple assumption about election, I understood you as having national politicians in mind. But if that's the case, then really it's a nested game, a 27 country nested game plus some European bureaucrats. And that's complicated, but it will be true that in certain national settings, the policy preferences will depend on what happens in the other national settings because they're in competition with one another. And that immediately makes it hugely more complicated than the game you currently have. So you do have to address why you're doing one rather than the other, I feel. And then there is a small point that I'd also like to make, but you're making the assumption on page 11 that firms are willing to invest potential future income into lobbying in order to obtain a policy, which sounds intuitively plausible, but empirically has been not verified by any of the people who are studying lobbying behavior. My favorite title on this is Ansolo Bahir, who wrote in 2003 an article called "Why Is There So Little Money in US Politics?" which, we can all laugh about because there's obviously tons of money in US politics, but it's nowhere close the actual economic benefits that companies get out of regulation once it's put into place. So you should be careful to maybe adjust assumptions about what companies will invest in lobbying activities. I will spare you the minor comments about spell checking because it's an early draft, but I just want to point out, please be careful not to say deregularization when you mean deregulation, because at one point I was thinking you're talking about migrant regularization or something, and then I realized there was just a spelling mistake. The results. So there are a couple of interesting results that I think are helpful going forward about the likelihood, depending on the proximity to the policymaker and the pivotal nature of the pivotality. I don't know if that's a word of the economic agents. But I was thinking the result when you were talking about the 28th regime, which finds that when it's only about startups, it doesn't work. But when incumbents and startups actually go in the same direction, then we're likely to see policy change. If that's your major finding, then you're going a very long way to come at the very, very intuitive conclusion that if the incumbent and the newcomer agree, then you get policy change. So I would caution you not to build up a very complicated game theoretical model to say the number one rule in politics, if you have an alignment between strange bedfellows, then the policy will go through. So maybe highlight what about it really was surprising and when you present the results. And I will leave it here so you can answer and we can have a discussion with
Thank
everybody.
you very much, Cornelia, also for staying 10 minutes perfectly. I will give to Maria the opportunity to briefly react to the comments.
Well, I mean, thank you so much. This is my reaction for reading this early draft, and I'm sorry that we even had spelling mistakes in the draft. And, I agree with everything you say. And this is really things that we are thinking about and that we have to incorporate. So, of course, all this idea about why the opposition, why is there going to be opposition? What does this depend on? Well, of course, we have to discuss all the literature that we didn't have time to discuss, and all the cost-benefit analysis. This idea about other groups, like, firms from all over the place, this is super important to incorporate as well. This one thing we have been talking about is, yes, this idea of, is this local? Is this at the European Union level? And what we think is that we have to analyze both levels, because what has happened in the past sometimes is that there has been movement at the European Union level, but then when the policies have to be implemented at the local level, the game changes. So both levels are very interesting and relevant, and you could have this situation where there is change at one level, but then it is not really implemented at the local level. Opening up the model for competition, that sounds really complicated, although very, very interesting. And why is there so little money? Okay, yes, that's also something to think about. I mean, thank you so much for all the comments, and yes, we will all take all of them into account. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks. I think that we have some minutes for questions. There is a first question, Tobias.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Maria, for this wonderful paper. Cornelia has already done a great job in making your life more complicated. I can a little bit add to that, I think, because one thing that I would highlight is in your model, it's a trade-off, or it's a game between certain types of firms. But what we know from practice is essentially that the most fierce lobbying against these proposals comes from people who tangentially benefit or lose out from these things. For example, gatekeepers, notaries, though their utility function is important, then labor also, of course. It's not really firm incumbents, but maybe you can model an agent in your model that also is outside of the firm and does not necessarily derive their value from what the firm does, but are somewhat and then the second question that popped to my mind was, it's interesting to understand when things go through, but of course, there's also the element of whether things should go through, because when you motivated your research, it sounded a little bit like, there seems to be an efficiency trade-off, right? So we can have an optimal regime on the one hand, and we can have one that is achievable. And of course, we should not necessarily say anything that's achievable is desirable, because it can be that this is also something. So therefore, and I think it's in your setup, it's possible to also model a social optimum, saying, okay, look, when the overall utility gains are larger than you might want to have that, and where's the equilibrium where we can strike that and where we should shed that. And I think that's the two suggestions that I have at that stage.
We have time for a last question, maybe.
Thank you very much, Tobias. what you are saying is relevant. You are thinking about, I think, transfers of value from some groups to others. We didn't want to get there yet, but yeah, that's something that we should think about. Well, what is achievable here? We are saying just that different people have different preferences, but of course, if we want to be normative, we should think about what is better. Yes.
Thanks. We have time for the last question. There are no other questions. Maybe I would like to ask one because I find your paper very interesting. Of course, it's really a framework that is useful to understand what we have ahead in the next months. But my question is about the 28 regime, because the 28 regime is much broader than EU Inc. And so it's not all about corporate law. And my feeling, I have not an economic design or an economic model behind that, but this is just a feeling that probably the resistance are stronger in tax law or labor law, maybe to some extent capital market law. Does your model apply to all these different areas, or do you think that maybe resistance and lobbyist activities are less stronger in some areas and stronger in the others?
Well, I mean, this is, I think maybe the bad thing, but also the good thing about this type of model is that it's very abstract. So that's good in the sense that you can think about applying it to other areas, but it's also maybe not so satisfactory because you don't see all the small players and different cases playing out. But I think what I will say is that probably the reason why we are talking about business law and not other areas of law will be capturing the model in the parameters that have to do with lobbying. Probably, the lobbying of notaries is probably not so strong compared to the lobbying of unions. And then also in terms of taxation, no? So if you reincorporate companies, if you can reincorporate companies in other places, this is very relevant for taxation. So these are parameters that are present in the model and that will be different if we were talking about other types of laws or regulation. So yeah, that's something also to think about. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I thank you, Maria and Cornelia, for the presentation and the discussion. Very insightful. Many thanks for being with us. And now we can move to the last paper by Paul Oudin, ESSEC, Paris. And Paul will try to answer a big question, I think, whether the 28 regime of the EU Inc. can compete with the Delaware. That's more the big question, and we will see what Paul think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So that's indeed a very big question, and I don't even hope to provide a comprehensive answer to it, but I will do my best. So the paper I'm presenting today is a paper I've been working on for quite some time now. I started working on it, I think, in March or April, not of this year, but of the previous year. And so what I'm trying to do in this paper is essentially provide a framework for what we are trying to achieve with this 28th regime. So it's a paper that the first version of which I have written before the Commission's proposal was published, and now it has been accepted for publication. And it still doesn't cover the Commission's proposal, but the idea is that the framework I developed there is a way to understand whether or not any future legislative developments make sense. So we all know that the purpose of the 28th regime, to a large extent, is to restore competitiveness in the EU, to attract and retain talented entrepreneurs, etc., etc. So the overarching goal is quite clear, but the means to achieve this goal have never really been explicitly stated. And so basically what I'm trying to achieve in this paper is figure out what can the 28th regime actually hope to achieve to reach this goal of promoting competitiveness in the EU. And so for some measures, this goal is quite clear. So for instance, if you think about the measures relating to corporate filing, the digitization of these procedures, etc., it's quite clear that their purpose is to make incorporation and corporate filings cheaper and easier. Same thing for employee share ownership plans. So the aim of the measures concerning these plans is to make employment in these companies more attractive and to make European innovative companies more attractive to employees in general. But if you look at the big picture, I think, so aside from these specific measures, there are essentially three things that the Commission's proposal can hope to achieve. So the first thing is to diminish the costs relating to red tape. So this is what I was mentioning when I was talking, for instance, about the corporate registration procedures. This is not something I'm going to cover here today because I think that this objective is quite straightforward. Something else the Commission can hope to achieve is to design rules that are substantively better than national corporate rules, and that's obviously something that is quite difficult. And finally, and this is something that I'm going to focus on in this presentation, the Commission is trying to diminish the cost of fragmentation of the fragmentation of corporate law for European companies. So essentially, what the Commission is saying, if you look at the press release that accompanied the Commission's proposal, is so European innovative companies are faced with 27 different corporate regimes, and this diversity is costly to these companies. But that's not exactly the case, because when you think about it, a company is only subject to the rules of this jurisdiction of incorporation, right? So for instance, if I create a company in France, my company is going to be subject to the French corporate rules. And it doesn't really matter that I'm going to have operations in Germany, Italy, or Spain, because all that matters is that my company is in France, I'm subject to French corporate law, and I could, of course, be facing, I don't know, German or Spanish consumer law if I operate in these countries. But the fragmentation of corporate law does not matter to me. It really doesn't matter. But on the other hand, this fragmentation is going to matter from the perspective of external investors, right? So this is a common theme that has been talked about in the previous presentations today. But if you are an investor and you invest cross-border in various companies in various European member states, then you will have to deal with various corporate rules, right? So, for instance, if you invest in a French, an Italian, and a German or Romanian company, each time you are going to conclude a shareholder agreement, you will subscribe to a share issuance in these companies, you will have to deal with different sets of rules. And this, I claim, is really what is really the core of the issue with corporate law fragmentation in Europe. So by default, whenever you do not have a better reason to harmonize the law in Europe, the reason why the European legislator should seek to harmonize corporate law is to remedy the cost of fragmentation for cross-border investors, not for companies. Now, the question is, what kind of measures can achieve this aim? So there are several things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the legislative approach for doing this. So what many people advocated for initially was the creation of a new corporate form at the European level. So we would have had one single corporate form that would have been entirely governed by European law and completely immune of the diversity of national corporate rules. Now, the problem that I think many of you are aware of with this approach is that there are very strong political barriers to implementing such a corporate form, not the least of which being the fact that to create a corporate form like this, you would have to use the legislative procedure of Article 352 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which requires unanimity of the member states in the Council. And this would have meant that if we wanted to use this procedure, all of the member states should have agreed on a regulation that would have been so broad as to cover the entire universe of corporate rules that govern this company. And so in my view, it's an excellent thing that the Commission in the end chose to use a regulation that is based not on Article 352, but on Article 114, which prevented it from creating this new autonomous corporate form, but still allowed it to reform part of the national rules, national corporate rules. And the reason why I do not believe that we need such an ambitious project as the creation of a new corporate form that would be entirely governed by European law, aside from the political challenges this poses, is that, as I said before, what we really need to care about are these specific rules that VC funds themselves care about. So, for instance, if we manage to harmonize the rules that apply to shareholder agreements, to share issuances, to preemption rights, to these kind of things, our VC investors will be happy and they will not need us to harmonize absolutely every aspect of corporate law. Okay, so essentially, just to summarize what I just said, what we need to do is harmonize at least a few rules that relate to the capital structure of companies and to shareholder agreements. And if we manage to identify these aspects of the law that VC investors are concerned with, then we are going to get tremendous gains from harmonization without needing to harmonize absolutely every aspect of corporate law. Now, I think I say in my paper that these rules should be designed in a specific way. So the first thing is that if you really want to diminish the costs of fragmentation, you want your rules to be really harmonized, not partly harmonized, right? So what I advocate for is the maximal harmonization of these aspects of the law that are relevant to cross-border VC investors. And what that means in turn is that we should limit gold plating as much as we can. Because if member states are able to gold plate the rules, of course, you will reintroduce fragmentation through the back door, and the benefits of harmonization will only be partly reaped by the VC investors. So for instance, if you harmonize the rules that apply to share issuances by EU Inc. entities, this is a very good thing for VC investors. They will know that each time they subscribe to a share issuance, they will be subject to the same rules. But if member states are able to add additional conditions to these share issuances, for instance, by requiring a specific majority of the shareholders, then again, our VC investors will have to solicit legal advice in all of the countries in which they invest, different legal advice from different people. And this will represent a cost. Okay, there we go. So the second thing is that, and this echoes what I was saying earlier, but the rules you're trying to harmonize should serve a specific purpose. We should not just try to harmonize corporate law for the sake of harmonizing corporate law. We should not try to create a genuinely European corporate form for the sake of it. Because as I said, this is politically costly and we need to focus on the measures that are going to be effectively useful to companies and their investors. And so only these rules, which have a clear purpose and can effectively be harmonized, should be harmonized. Now, if I can give a counterexample, think about fiduciary duties. So the fiduciary duties are one of the things that the Commission's proposal at the moment is trying to harmonize. And this could be theoretically good that every company in Europe and their directors be subject to the same fiduciary duties, except that there are several problems with that. The first issue is that the purpose of harmonizing fiduciary duties is not that clear at all. VC investors, when they invest in a company, do not really care about the regime, the fiduciary duty regime to which a company is subject, right? So they may care about some aspects of it. For instance, if the local rules allow the directors to consider different classes of shareholders differently, that might interest them at the margin. But in general, they're not going to do a big due diligence relating to the fiduciary duty regime of the company in the country in which they invest. So for instance, if I am a French venture capital investor and I'm investing in an Italian company, I'm not going to delve into Italian fiduciary duty law at the time when I invest in the company, right? This is a problem that may come up later. If later on I want to sue the directors of that Italian company, I will have to deal with the local fiduciary duty regime. But at this point, I will have to hire local counsels anyway to trigger these proceedings, right? So the benefits of knowing fiduciary duties ex ante are not obvious at all. And the second thing is that harmonizing fiduciary duties is extremely difficult, right? Because if you look at the Commission's proposal, what it's saying essentially at the moment is that it wants to create specific duties of care and of loyalty, essentially. I don't remember the exact wording, but there is a very broad wording that defines these fiduciary duties. And there is a risk that the national jurisdictions of each member states interpret these duties differently, right? Because if you have a duty of loyalty all across Europe, it's not a given that a French judge will interpret loyalty in the same way as an Italian judge. And so this in itself is a barrier to harmonization. And the last thing is that fiduciary duty law is, first of all, concerns, if you look at several member states, does not concern specific corporate forms. These are rules that apply across the board to every corporate form, which makes any targeted reform difficult. And the other thing is that there are strong vested interest from legal practitioners in maintaining the law as it exists today. So not only would be the harmonization of fiduciary duties very difficult to implement technically, but politically it would also be it could also be extremely complex. And so essentially, as you probably guessed by now, I do not believe that fiduciary duties should be within the scope of the proposal. All right, so then there is another aspect that I mentioned in the paper and that I think is quite important, which is modularity. And what I mean by modularity is that you may have different measures that have different political salience, and there is a risk that if one package of measures fails, then this triggers the failure of the other measures. So what I advocate for in the paper is that if you have different broad categories of topics you want to deal with, you should deal with them separately. So if I can give an example, when you look at the Commission's proposal, you see that there are, I think, 2 or 3 chapters that are dedicated to corporate filings and digital procedures. These issues do not have anything to do directly with the harmonization of substantive corporate law, right? So we could have perfectly imagined that the Commission would have made a proposal for corporate filings and a second different proposal for substantive corporate rules. And as it stands, there is a risk that should political the measures on corporate filing be opposed too strongly, the failure of these measures triggers the failure of the other measures contained in the regulation. So there is a risk of, so to speak, cross-contamination of the failure of some measures and others. Basically, so the failure of some measures might affect other measures that have nothing to do with them. Okay, so that's essentially the broad framework that I have developed in the paper. And now, since the Commission's proposal has been now published, I thought that it would be interesting to see the application of my recommendations to the current proposal. So I have already mentioned a few, but I can summarize them here. So the first thing is that, as I said, I believe that using a regulation based on the procedure of Article 114 TFEU with the creation of 27 different corporate forms in 27 different countries is not a problem in itself. Because, as I said, what we care about is the harmonization of some specific aspects of corporate law. We do not need to harmonize the entire regime of these corporate forms. And precisely for this reason, we do not need all these corporate forms to be strictly identical. To me, it's not the problem that by default, we have a core of European rules that applies across the board, and then the rest of the rules that are still governed by national laws. Then if you look at the financing rules in the proposal, I also think that obviously that these measures are worth harmonizing. So I'm referring, for instance, to share issuances, preemption rights, etc. So there is a clear case that the proposal did well by harmonizing these specific rules. Their content can be discussed, and as a matter of fact, I do not entirely agree with the wording of these measures, but as a matter of principle, these questions should be covered by the Commission's proposal. But now, as I already hinted before, I do not believe, for the reasons I already presented, that fiduciary duties should be covered by the proposal, nor that using one single regulation, both for corporate filings and for the substantive harmonization of corporate law, makes sense. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now, I think that you raised many points. I don't know if you are very optimistic about the competition with Delaware, but now we will listen from the discussion. Maribel Sáez Lacave, Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay. As I said, good afternoon, everyone, and so thank you so much for being there. Today, so I'm going to comment and discuss Oudin's paper. And first of all, overall, I find the paper extremely valuable and timely. It clearly identifies many of the structural frictions affecting venture capital-backed firms in Europe. However, I would like to suggest that the proposal could potentially be expanded beyond startups, framed in a more ambitious way. So let me begin by briefly summarizing the paper. So the paper focuses on the regulatory problems faced by venture capital backed firms operating across European jurisdictions. So Oudin's central arguments has 2 components. First, the paper argues that the true supranational company structure is politically and technically infeasible. And second, the paper proposes that targeted harmonization measures could achieve many of the same benefits with fewer political and institutional drawbacks, okay? So I think this framing is really persuasive and also pragmatic, but at the same time, I would suggest a slightly more expressive title for the paper, perhaps something like, the case for a harmonized corporate form for startups. So I think that this alternative title would better capture the normative ambition on the paper and make the contribution clearer. So my main comment concerns the scope of the proposal. So the 28th regime is presented as a startup-oriented framework, but I would ask, why stop there? Okay. So in my view, the core value of the 28th regime is not limited to startups. Its significance is broader, and it lies in allowing firms to opt out of a rigid, inefficient, path-dependent, and fragmented national corporate regimes. So these problems are not unique to early stage corporations, okay, or companies. So many firms operating across EU jurisdictions face similar issues, costly incorporation rules, inconsistent governance requirements, and legal fragmentation that also increases transaction costs. So, but I do really understand the logic, the strategic logic behind the paper, the logic of focusing specifically on startups. Politically, a startup-tailored regime may encounter less resistance from domestic bureaucracies and national interest groups. So presenting the regime as a narrow innovation policy tool could make it easier to adopt. However, I think there are also costs to maintaining such a narrow focus. What the startups basically need is flexibility. And flexibility is not a scarce regulatory resource. So a more flexible corporate regime could be offered simultaneously to many types of firms without imposing additional costs. So, and on the other hand, restricting the proposal to startups may reduce the coalition of actors willing to support the reform, okay? So in other words, narrowing the scope may reduce opposition, but may also reduce political support, okay? So this leads to my second point. I'm not fully convinced that a startup-specific regime is more desirable to a more flexible European corporate form. So the first issue concerns freedom of contract. So academic research has shown that venture capital contracting is already largely the product of private ordering and market practices, okay? So in other words, the contractual structures used by startups emerge from sophisticated market interactions rather than from legal templates. Because of this, a highly tailored startup regime may harden current market practices into law. In my view, this creates the risk of future path dependence. So, in other words, what appears optimal today may become rigid tomorrow, okay? So in sum, a more flexible framework will better accommodate future changes in financing structures, governance models, and entrepreneurial practices. So my second concern is about scaling. If the regime is specifically designed for startups, firms may face disincentives to grow beyond that category in the European Union and flip over to other countries. So in practice, companies may eventually need to transition back into domestic corporate structures when they become established firms. And I think that creates discontinuities and potentially undermines the goal of fostering long-term European growth. And finally, the startup-specific framing may relegate, perhaps unintentionally, incumbent firms. So established firms may perceive the reform as irrelevant to their own governance needs. And as a result, the proposal risks becoming politically isolated, broad enough to attract criticism, but too narrow to build a strong coalition to support, okay? So Paul identifies three major frictions faced by startups at their current European corporate regimes: red tape, rigidity, and fragmentation across jurisdictions. I think this diagnosis is entirely correct. But again, I will ask whether these are truly startup-specific problems. Many sophisticated firms, not only startups, rely on private ordering and complex governance arrangements for investors. Think of private equity, cross-border SMEs, mature corporations, and even corporate groups increasingly need adaptable governance structures and efficient contracting mechanisms. So in my view, the paper's own diagnosis may support a broader conclusion than the one it reaches. So the paper also raises important concerns about the feasibility of a fully harmonized European corporate form. So Paul correctly identifies two major obstacles: political resistance and technical watering down during implementation. However, I think the specific characteristics of the 28th regime may mitigate some of these concerns. So, for example, because the regime would be optimal, this means cohabits with domestic regulation, firms will not need to relocate across jurisdictions to benefit from it. This reduces the threat perceived by domestic regulators. Also, if the regime were enacted as a regulation rather than a directive, there should be or would be less room for gold plating and national divergence during the implementation. So this is important because one of the, as he said before, one of the historical problems of harmonization in Europe has been the national transposition often reintroduces fragmentation, okay? So although concerns about political feasibility are real, the institutional design of the 28th regime may make successful harmonization more, I think, achievable than previous initiatives. So let me conclude with a broader observation. I believe the 28th regime should be more ambitious, and perhaps we should also be more optimistic about its prospects. So, historical comparisons with earlier European corporate forms may not fully apply here. The current proposal has different design characteristics and emerges in a very different political and economical context. So, in fact, Europe's current economic challenges may create precisely, the kind of political, let's say, momentum necessary for reform. So, as Kingdom famously argued, major policy changes often become possible when problems, political mood, and institutional opportunities align. The present economic climate, concerns about competitiveness, innovation, and capital market fragmentation may actually increase receptiveness to institutional reforms. So rather than viewing the 28th regime as politically unrealistic, perhaps we might instead see it as increasingly timely. So to conclude, I strongly really agree with the paper's diagnosis of the structural weaknesses affecting venture capital-backed firms in Europe, startups. My main suggestion is simply that the proposal could go further, okay? So flexible and optional European corporate regime may have value not only for startups, but for a much wider range of firms operating with the European market. So this is it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks, Maribel, for your comments. That I think you focus on, at least in my opinion, a key point of the proposal, like also a key criticism from some other point of view. But maybe I will let Paul reply first of all, then we can open the floor to the audience.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you so much, Maribel, for your very insightful comments and for taking the time to read my paper. Yeah, I will start actually by addressing your last comment, because I am fully in line with you in terms of our shared optimism in terms of the proposal's chances of success. I know that many people in this room are quite skeptical about these chances, but I do think that the context has changed since the failed projects of the SP and the SUP. I also think that the proposal is timely and that we are in an economic context where interests are aligned, and it has become difficult to oppose this kind of legislative evolution. So in terms of extending the recommendations beyond VC-backed firms, I completely agree that the proposal can benefit other firms than VC-backed firms, but precisely for the reason you mentioned, namely avoiding unnecessary political resistance, I do think that the proposal should still be framed in terms of something aimed for VC-backed startups rather than private companies in general. In terms of, so you say that the framework I propose does not implicitly target incumbent firms. I think that this is both a bug and a feature, and especially a feature in my view, in the sense that I believe that big companies that could benefit today from this regime, for instance, groups with multiple subsidiaries across the EU, so on one hand could benefit from the proposal and so could lend some support to it. But I also believe that these firms are precisely those that are advised by legal intermediaries that also have a very strong interest in preventing the law from evolving too much. And so I really don't have a clear answer as to whether or not this would be a good strategy politically. But my intuition is that extending the perimeter of people concerned by the proposal a bit too much might cause more harm than good in terms of from a political standpoint. And yeah, maybe one last remark on. So you mentioned the risk of path dependence in case we reform the corporate law in a certain way. So essentially, your argument, if I understand it well, is that we could harmonize today corporate law in a way that benefits VC firms of today, but that doesn't mean that the corporate law we harmonize today will benefit the firms of tomorrow with the funding practices of tomorrow. And this is something I completely agree with. And for this reason, I believe that most of the harmonization measures should actually increase private ordering to the benefit of companies and their investors. They shouldn't necessarily say, for instance, if you think about preemption rights, I wouldn't be in favor of a provision that says exactly how these preemption rights should be designed, how they should be exercised, etc. Instead, I would be favorable to a provision that simply says, for everything relating to the preemption rights, just look at the bylaws of the company. Maybe we propose one default rules, but in any case, contractual flexibility should really be one of the main features of the proposal. So I will stop here. Thank you so much once again for your comments.
Okay.
And
we have already 3 questions. So the first, Eva Mikeler was the first one. So please, Eva.
Thank you for firstly a beautiful conference and then a wonderful presentation. So my question is, when I heard you first present and start your talk, I thought this was going to end up being an empirical paper. And I asked, and what I say this because I very much like the idea of focusing on the preferences of VC investors. So, and that because after all, this is what this all is about: finding money from investors to scale up. And then when you move into saying, here's what they want, I'm interested what the empirical basis is for that. And in particular, how do you know that they don't care about fiduciary duties?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. So I actually wrote a section in my paper dedicated to this very issue. So it's true that I discussed the paper with VC funds, and so they were broadly in line with my recommendations. So that's obvious, very meager empirical evidence, and nothing that could support like definitive conclusions in the paper. But so what I say in the paper is that I essentially don't have any clear-cut empirical evidence to support that this is what should matter, but I'm making a theoretical argument that if this reform project matters at all, then these are the measures that we will want to care about. So essentially, my argument is to say that either we need to harmonize corporate law to the benefit of these investors, or we accept that this is all for nothing, and in fact, harmonization is just not helpful in the first place. Does it answer your question?
Well, I mean, when you jump to recommendations of that kind and say, I think the big thing is I want to find out what investors want, then I think it would be very useful to go all the way and then, properly interview or, go through agreements and see what they normally contain, or so have some way of then, delivering a more than the theoretical assumptions that they make. But I fully agree with the idea that this is about the preferences of the investors.
No, I did discuss this with investors, but I didn't do formal interviews or collect empirical evidence that I could reuse in the paper directly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. So the next question, Vanessa Knapp.
Thank you very much. I also had a question about the fiduciary duties of directors, because I think that many VCs actually do want to put somebody on the board. And so although they may not be particularly interested in fiduciary duties of directors, I do think there would be a benefit if they knew that wherever they were investing in member states, it would be basically the same law that would be applying to people, just because that makes life easier for them. So I was interested that you thought that fiduciary duties really isn't that interesting for them.
Yeah, I may be wrong, but that was indeed my impression. But if you are of a different view and you have arguments in this favor, I would be very interested in hearing them, because it's true that I may have overlooked something here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next question, Casimiro.
Thank you for letting me talk, and Paul for the presentation. So I'm sorry, Paul, but I'm also interested in knowing a bit more about your views on fiduciary duties, because based on my knowledge and our work with Look into BS, we actually find that fiduciary duties matter quite a lot, meaning that in a VC-backed company, what you have is so-called constituency directors. So they actually are to be held accountable by the sponsors, and a venture capitalist wants to know what the directors seat appoints can do or cannot do. So allowing them to pursue partisan strategies which might benefit the investors, to even in some instances to if this means the sacrificing the interest of the funders, is quite important. What they can do, what they cannot do, is crucial. Is not secondary at all. And so I am very kind of unsure that the kind of claim you make can hold after all. But that's basically what we have explained also in the latest paper. What we suggest is that if there are model documents, they should definitely be coupled with second order rules, call them meta rules or whatever you like, that actually allow the judges, whenever having to adjudicate a litigation about how the rights have been exercised, including how directors have made decisions, should definitely be calibrated to the specific needs of the venture capital. So I'm strongly disagreeing on this, but that's of course something which you might want to take into account or not. Thank you.
So I agree and disagree with you at the same time. So I agree in the sense that I might be a bit too strong in my claim in the paper, saying that fiduciary duties don't matter at all. I mean, I'm not exactly saying that, but you see the idea. But that said, I think that the one qualification I could make in the paper is to say the following things: you don't need to harmonize the entirety of fiduciary duties across Europe to achieve the purpose you're trying to achieve here. So what I mean here is that you could simply have a provision saying essentially that the member states should entitle the directors of the company to consider various constituencies in different ways, right? So you could have some specific provisions that explain exactly how part of the fiduciary duties of each member state should be tailored, without saying what these fiduciary duties are in the first place, right? So if I give a concrete example, you could imagine, instead of saying, as of now, the member states, the EU Inc. everywhere in Europe should have fiduciary duties of loyalty and care, you could simply say fiduciary duties are what they are, but member states should make sure that directors are able to consider various constituencies in different ways. I think that this kind of targeted measures would be more effective, and they would directly address the concern you just expressed, which is very valid.
Well, there are some comments in the chat, but basically it's about the relevance of fiduciary duties, and according to someone, fiduciary duties are not relevant so far as contracts are complete as the venture capital contracts are, but maybe we can also take the question, because I see the Luca want to ask a question.
Yes, I have a question that's actually quite general and draws from one of the comments by Marco Darin at the beginning. So the question is, what is it that makes the EU Inc. More attractive to a VC-backed firm than, say, a Dutch BV? So a Dutch company with all the contractual freedom that Dutch corporate law allows parties. So let's assume that sorry, I'm not an expert in Dutch law, but let's assume that Dutch law is almost as enabling as Delaware. Not it can be so, but still more than any other European jurisdiction. What's the advantage of becoming a Dutch EU Inc. rather than just a Dutch BV?
Okay, yeah, that's also a great point. So you could make the case that in theory, private companies should just choose the corporate form. We forget about EU Inc. We just take existing corporate forms, and private companies should just choose the corporate form that suits VC-backed companies best, right? So, for instance, if I'm a French founder, I just create a BV in the Netherlands, and I will benefit from this great attractive BV regime. But the problem is that, in fact, we see that there hasn't been such a broad phenomenon of corporate mobility in Europe, right? And this can be related to various reasons, but this phenomenon just has never arisen. We've never found one jurisdiction in continental Europe that has attracted much more entrepreneurs than any other. And so, based on that premise, the interest of having at least partly harmonized rules is that if I am a French company and I incorporate in France, or for that matter in the Netherlands as an EU Inc., I know that cross-border investors in Europe will know the regime to which I'm subject better than my local regime. And so hopefully this will make investment in my company by these cross-border investors less costly, right? So to take again your example, let's say I'm a Dutch founder, I'm in the Netherlands, and I have a choice between a national BV and an EU Inc. BV. I will prefer the EU Inc. BV because the Spanish, Italian, and French VC investors that might want to invest in my company will presumably be more familiar with the EU Inc. BV than with the simple BV, precisely because the regime of EU Inc. is partly harmonized across Europe. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Paul, Maribel, for your
Thanks, everyone, and Maribel especially.
I think that our time is over for this part of the webinar. So now we have a second break, still 15 minutes. Then we can be back at 4:15. Then we will have the final roundtable, and we discuss some also maybe policy-oriented issues and try to find some conclusions. Thank you very much to all. See you in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.